Build creative confidence. Beat the inspiration addiction. Join the Writer's Gym. The Oxford Companion to English Literature calls Ramsey Campbell Britain's most respected living horror writer, as, I will personally add, does everybody else. The Washington Post sums up his work as one of the monumental accomplishments of modern popular fiction. In 2015, he was made an Honorary Fellow of Liverpool John Moores University for outstanding services to literature. His latest novels are Fellstones, The Lonely Lands, The Incubations, An Echo of Children, and Ancestral. His Brichester Mythos trilogy consists of The Searching Dead, Born to the Dark, and The Way of the Worm. His most recent collections are Fearful Implications, a 2-volume retrospective roundup, Phantasmagorical Stories, and The Village Killings and Other Novellas. His non-fiction is collected as Ramsey Campbell, Probably, and Ramsey Campbell, Certainly. Ramsey's Rambles collects his video reviews, and Six Stooges and Counting is an appreciation of the Three Stooges. Limericks of the Alarming and Phantasmal is a history of horror fiction in 50 limericks.
It is. I shall give you one just to start
with. Oh, please.
Though you have no aversion to bugs, you may well draw the line at giant slugs. Should your lettuce at lunch seem too lacking in crunch, then the cause may crawl forth from your lugs. Oh. Dedicated to Sean Hudson.
Fantastic. Ramsey, you led me away from the Flame Tree bio that begins, has been given more awards than any other writer in the field. But there was something I really wanted to say about that, which is I really enjoyed you saying in the recent Horrorzine interview that when you were asked which awards were closest to your heart, and you said all of them because they mean somebody thought my stuff is better than I do. There's something so important about understanding that our own self-doubt is not objective fact, isn't there?
Yes. I mean, in my case, it's also something of an impetus. Seriously, these days I tend to get up in the morning. Well, let's start further back than that. I don't even get up yet. I wake in the morning, and if there's a work in progress, as there pretty well often is, I think, well, I've got nothing for it today. I've got no creative energy. I've got no ideas. There's no point in getting up. And then something will occur to me, a turn of phrase or an image or a line of dialogue. And I'll have to get up in order to record it. In the old days, it would be, pen and ink. These days, I tend to use the phone, although there's a tale in itself there, because I frequently see the phone take my dictation and then decide it didn't really mean that and change it out of all recognition. There's clearly a story in that which I've yet to write. But basically, I've come to the conclusion that depression and self-doubt are not an integral part of the process. I think it's probably a necessary part for me. I need to have that feeling that, I've lost it in order to find it again. The problem is, of course, knowing this intellectually is not the same thing as experiencing it emotionally. Would that it were. Make life a lot easier, but there you are. And equally, if I finish a new story, I tend to think, well, they're not going to want this, but I can send it somewhere else, or I can ultimately collect it in one of my own collections of short stories. If I finish a new novel, I send it to my agent, and I think one or two things. Either he's going to say, this is not what we expect of you at all. You've somehow gone way off beam. Or they're going to say, well, you've done this too often, you're simply repeating yourself now. And it's not until they say, oh, actually, we like it, that I feel, well, maybe I didn't yet get it wrong after all. And there you are.
And do you think that is cumulative? I suppose what I'm really asking is, with the Writer's Gym, we are exactly what that sounds like. We're about finding the regular habits that are right for that individual person, that allows them to keep up their fitness and happiness level within their own practice. That's absolutely what we're all about. But something that I find that I hear absolutely equally from people who have been writing for many years or decades very, very successfully, and people who are essentially picking up a pen to do something that they've wanted to do creatively for maybe the first time, or it's still new. The thing that I hear from everybody is how well phrased those demons are about either. I mean, I've read you talking about is the idea there, or there are too many ideas. We manage to sort of head ourselves up at the pass. Either it's too weird or it's too boring, or there are too many ideas, there are not enough ideas. And I guess for me, that's what I mean by not taking the thoughts in our heads as facts in the world. But I suppose my question is, because you know this about yourself, you know that those feelings are going to be there. It becomes that practice of knowing that you can continue in spite of them, rather than feel like you have to resolve those thoughts and feelings in order to do that.
I suppose it's a bit like that, but I mean, I'm not sure it's in spite of. In some ways, it's because of, the paradox. I suppose there's this to be said. As you say, it's cumulative. My impression was, certainly about myself anyway, is I needed to think I was good in the days when I wasn't that good. And now, if I am that good, I no longer feel it. So it was a necessary part of the process to have the sense that, I'm doing stuff that nobody else is doing back in the day. In order to do it, in order to get going, to take the path that I've followed. But now I've sort of found the path. Well, I feel, oh God, is this the only path I've got, basically? And I almost feel kind of, in particular, locked into a particular prose style. So every so often I will, deliberately find a different voice for, the character's voice, narrate it from the character's standpoint, or even, I've not done this for a little while by now, but over the years, I tend to find something I depend on as a writer. Let's say, for the sake of argument, it's kind of lyrical prose, if you like, which I think, is something I go in for quite a bit. And so I've occasionally deliberately tried to write a very flat style. I mean, the most extreme story called A Street Was Chosen, which is told entirely in the passive voice, as an experimental report of an experiment that only becomes gradually defined by the description. The characters they're not characterized at all. They're simply letters and identities, professions and the like. And the extraordinary thing is I've found, I've read that to audiences and I found it works, and people laugh and shudder, even though it's nothing but, a dead account. So these things can work. And I do think that setting that sort of exercise for oneself occasionally, just trying to do something utterly different from your usual practice can be quite fruitful.
Not instead of, but as well as. Also, from where I'm sitting, the opposite, that we all have an essential story or stories that we are exploring. We all have essential questions about who we are and our place in the world that authenticity means we will revisit again and again, that we are asking fundamental questions. And I've spoken to you about the influence of childhood and parents and the perception reality gap of what people are saying or thinking, and how we may misread what's going on for immediate family members. And this is something that I've always been drawn to, and I know is of course a huge thing for you, is that, I guess, reliability or not of these adult figures. That's something that horror is such an important place for, isn't it? That we, as children, we are fundamentally vulnerable.
Oh, very much so. But I think we also, in my answer, I'm sure it's true of many people, you think, well, that's how it is because that's your childhood. Certainly, I was getting on some in youthful years before I kind of looked outside and thought, well, not everybody lives this way, do they? There is something a bit odd about my childhood. But for a long time, I just took it for granted. This is what life, how it works, basically,
And the place of storytelling, I remember you saying about when you realised that what your mother was seeing wasn't what other people might call objective reality, and how there then needed to be a story that we tell the outside world, and that how you say it to her, it was very much a life skill in that way, wasn't it?
Oh, from a very early age, just about 3 years old, really, I became aware that, what she said was happening and what I'd just seen happening were two very different things, violently different things. And as you say, I sort of developed the way of dealing with this very, very early indeed. The trade-off really was that I couldn't talk about it to other people, basically largely because she brought me up not to do so. That was inculcated. Well, I mean, I don't think it's melodramatic to say indoctrinated into me. And so it was a long, long time, really, not really until she died, that I was able to. And there was a sudden sense of, the dam was broken. And all of a sudden I wrote this huge, long account of my childhood, and it was an immense relief, It wasn't sort of traumatic, quite the reverse. It was just, here it goes at last, basically. And it was very easy to write in its own way.
And the self-editing is always something we need to be aware of, isn't it? I talk about it in terms of a sort of artist palette. We've got our memories, we've got our imagination and our questions about the world, and our job is to be as free as possible to mix those things. But
yeah.
where you've had somebody really important saying, thou shalt not use this bit,
Yes,
you're going to be reacting very strongly against it.
Yes, I think so.
And it's, I think from the point of view of a lot of the people that I work with at the Writers' Gym, coming to a point where they acknowledge that they need to do that work, that you need to be able to say, actually, this is mine. This experience is mine.
Yeah. Oh, yes. Yes. And the more you can talk about yourself, the better. However you do it in fiction. Because, again, you see, for a long, long time, I wasn't really aware of some of the autobiographical elements in what I was writing. It may be that I needed not to be aware of them in order to write them. I remember I had one extraordinary experience. There's an old story of mine called The Chimney. Basically, it's about an adolescent boy who's a fearful kid, who's obsessed with the idea that this figure that comes down the chimney on Christmas Eve is, it's actually a very menacing idea. This intruder who comes down and wanders about your bedroom. And for a long, long time, I thought, well, I've invented all this. The notion of Christmas as being a place of dread, specifically of the Father Christmas figure, who turns out to be the father, crucially in my story. But I'd kind of forgotten that, my parents were estranged very early on, really, not long after this incident when I was 3 years old. So by the time I was 5, we were living in the same house, very small house, but they weren't speaking to each other, and they weren't, encountering wherever they could avoid it. And I was basically having been required to choose sides. I was with my mother, but she didn't see my father. He was basically this presence on the other side of the door. But there would be Christmas Day. I'd always be sent up to knock on his bedroom door and say, approximately, will you come down for Christmas dinner? And there would be a kind of mutter of dissent from the other side of the door. And I would flee downstairs, basically, that's over for another year at least. And of course, that was what that story was partly about. And I remember reading it to an audience at Jack Sullivan's apartment in New York, because he used to invite a whole bunch of people around to hear me read every time I was in New York. And all of a sudden this came upon me as a kind of tremendous shock. I think I remember having to stop in the middle of it and say, I'm sorry, folks, I'm going to tell you what this is about. And, there's some epiphany, revelation. And I suppose there are other instances, throughout my stuff, but that was one spectacular example.
This, I hope, I can see being so encouraging for a lot of people listening to this, that it's not necessarily about knowing what we're doing. It's about allowing ourselves to do it.
Absolutely.
And working out what we were mixing, what was going on later.
Yes.
And you've been a very good influence, I think, not just to me, but far and wide about you. Actually, in the acknowledgements of An Echo of Children was the effect of It's a Compulsion, this writing lark. And the idea that a compulsion is a very positive thing. It's permission, really, isn't it? That writing every day, it's not about how to make myself do it. It's the fact that my brain works like this.
Oh, yeah.
And you get a healthier version. Certainly you get better Rachel for your money if I've written than if I haven't.
Yes. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And that is important, isn't it? And
I'd say, yes.
I think you've said that your best creative time is something, was it 7 a.m. to 12 or something?
Yes, approximately, that's right. Or maybe 6 till 12, Yeah, but the mornings are my time for fiction specifically. And then the afternoons, I tend to talk to you, for instance, obviously. Here I am doing it. But, also non-fiction tend to get done, and proofreading, stuff like that, tends to be the afternoon work. Then eventually off and go and watch a movie.
And do you find that a sort of mental emotional alarm goes off that after this point it will be diminishing returns? Do you
Yes. Oh, yes, very much so. Yes, I feel the kind of, the creative energy beginning to fade a little bit. I try and find a sort of natural break in the narrative. Some sort of point of transition. Ideally something like moving from the setting to a dialogue, something like that is perfect, but things of that nature. There are a couple of tricks I have taught myself is basically before I've completely finished, have a little bit of a think about what tomorrow's session, how that will begin and what it may contain. Now, often enough, when I get up in the morning, I'll think, well, no, actually, that doesn't work. I'm going to have to do something different or, something related to it. But, part of the process is sorting out the good ideas from the bad. And a more general principle, really, the one thing I have learned is always to develop at least, or compose, I beg your pardon, compose at least the first sentence before I sit down to write.
It's leaving notes for future self, isn't it?
There's that, but also, I'm not faced with this horrible blank page staring back at me. I've got something to put there, and then, even if I revise it onto the page as I write it, because, the initial idea may not be the best one, but at least it then leads into today's session, and that does work for me.
It was interesting you mentioned the phone notebook for that, because that's another really good way of doing that, isn't it? That you do think into it and then it's there for you. It's never quite a blank page.
Oh, no, that's right.
I always think of it like layering a canvas, it's just sort of splodge and then you work your way. You talked about how, I may misrepresent this, so please do correct me on this, but the idea of courting writer's block is essentially to not do what we've just described there, to, I guess, be too prescriptive.
Well, the only time I've ever suffered it, thank heaven, this was way back in, the very early 1970s. I started a story called Litter. I wrote the first day's work, was, page and a bit. And then the next day I didn't feel, now, admittedly, I had a day job. I was working at the public libraries in Liverpool. So, it wasn't as if I was doing it full time. But the next day, I didn't feel that much like, carrying on, so I didn't. And the following day, I felt even less like carrying on, so I didn't. And it just built up this huge wall between me and the story. I think it was 6 months. I thought, I've got to do something somehow. And what I basically did, I just started it again. Within the story, I actually wrote, I think the line is, that's how the story begins, or this is. And then we restart the narrative. Now, what I should have done was incorporate that first page or so of material, within the narrative. But actually, I'm quite glad I left it that way, because it stands as a horrid monument to what happens if you do, allow yourself to get blocked. I think it was partly allowing myself, not doing because I didn't feel like it. Well, I then discovered, well, you've got to do it even if you don't feel like it. Because, and this is one thing I did discover quite early on, that I can't really tell which material was an effort to write and distinguish that from the stuff that was fluid. Well, to a certain extent, if I could remember which was which, but simply from reading it, I can't necessarily spot where I had to chip it out of stone, as it were. The work itself is the effort is its own justification, ultimately.
Yes, and that's another sort of pin badge I'd want to print for every writer out there, is that when something's hard, bloody work and you're not enjoying it, it doesn't necessarily mean it's not going to be as good as the stuff that feels that flows through you and it's out of you and into the world.
Exactly. Usually it's a mix of both,
Yes, absolutely. But I do think it's something that people do hold themselves back with, isn't it? The idea that inspiration is actually a goal in itself, rather than the perspiration.
Oh, absolutely. And the other thing is, I think it's probably a good bit of advice is, don't get lured away by the sort of will-o'-the-wisp of the next idea. You're writing a story and then, then you get an idea and think, my God, that's a good idea. I've got to write that one. But the trouble is, of course, that will take just as much work as what you're working on now. The idea, that lights up your brain. But then there's the dimmer portion, if you like, of working it out.
There's a couple of things potentially going on there. Can I ask you about that? Because, for me, it's about the fake ending. It's about, I know it's important to do something that is an ending for this, even if the ending is not remotely like the ending that I want to eventually have. If I've given it an ending and a nice shiny other fish in David Lynch language has gone past and I want, right, we're going over there. Yes, I can absolutely go over there as long as I have parked an ending on this and not just gone, I'm bored, I'm off over here, or ooh, squirrel, I'm off over here,
Yeah.
Is that making sense? That for me feels like an important difference, that you give it an ending.
I must admit, I wouldn't risk that personally. I won't go to the next one till I finish this one.
At all?
No. I think I only
not even a key word, not even...
Oh yeah. Oh, sorry. I'll write the ideas down and develop the idea. but I won't start writing it as a narrative. I won't start that new story. But, oh, yes, I'll certainly amass all the material alongside doing whatever the story in progress may be. That's for absolutely sure. The only time I've ever done what I just said I would never do, was way back in the first book of Lord, I was 16, and I was writing the actual story, The Inhabitant of the Lake, which is title story of my first book, in fact, first published book, I should say. I'd only done a couple of pages on that, I think, and then what happened was August Derleth had bought my first short story to be included in an anthology, and he'd revised it somewhat, with my permission. He said he needed to edit it a bit in order to publish it. Well, all right, fair enough. I mean, subsequently I edited my own stuff, which he was happy for me to do. But in this instance, he sent me a carbon, back in the old days of typing paper and carbon, of his version of my story. And this kind of inspired me. I thought, that's the way to do it, but I'd like to do that in my own way. And I immediately flipped to another story that I was planning to write and abandoned the one in progress and wrote that. It was an extraordinary sort of liberation. I was doing stuff that I hadn't previously done in those stories. It was a lot looser, actually, a lot more relaxed in some ways. It's not a great story. A story called The Rending of the Veil, but it invented my old pal Deoloth, who figures in a lot of later stuff. But this was where he appeared first of all.
Can we just give that a little bit of a shout out as well, because you just said, to your mind, that is not a good story, but it created something that had such a scope that even when we don't feel that great about something, we don't know what's going to happen next.
Oh gosh, well, you see, this is it. I found this extraordinary. Here I invented the old chap when I was 16. It's all over the internet. It's people's internet identity. There's heavy metal tracks about him, innumerable paintings and drawings and stuff, and stories based on, and including him or referring to him. And I found this kind of, rather humbling in its way. How is this possible? But somehow it's happened, so there we are.
We were talking about self-editing, or something that I find quite fascinating, terrifying, is that, I may be exaggerating this, but I think you show Jenny, your wife, a chapter at a time, even when the book isn't finished yet. And I'm fascinated by this, because the idea of a book,
No, Jenny likes to read them, that's it, you see, just as simple as that. So, and, she kind of, on occasion, she just make point me at something, or say, you've changed this character's, minor character's name or something, as can happen, increasing it with my advancing senility. Nothing is going to happen. Who knows? And, occasionally I've called a character God help us. Yeah, it is indeed in the work in progress. And at one point, only for a couple of paragraphs, I managed to call the protagonist by the name of a minor character. God help us. So there you are. But Jenny pointed that out, so that's gone now.
I don't mean to dismiss the point that it can be memory, but I don't know if this is a thing for you, but sometimes a story that I thought was going to be in past tense decides it's writing itself in present tense, and sometimes a person who I thought had this name is rebelling and turns out to have that name. Was that something different? Does that happen to you, where sometimes the story just tells you, I know you thought I was doing this, but you're not.
Oh, yes. Good heavens. Oh, good heavens. Yes, very much so. In the development, or in the first draft, or very, very often in the rewrite. And we haven't really got onto that yet. I mean, if you want me to ramble on a bit about that.
Please, yeah.
I am in the process of rewriting a new novel right now, which will be presumably, where are we? But this will be the 2027 novel now. It will be, I guess. Assuming they want it, because, they may not. We'll have to find out. So, I mean, how this works is just the general process of a novel for me these days. So, to go all the way back to the start, I get the idea, I then try and develop it in terms of what is this about, who will it happen to, where will it happen, what are the characters called, what do they do in life, where do they live, what are their relationships. And of course I've got none of that to begin with, or very little of it, and so it feels like wandering about in this creative limbo, where there's nothing in sight and no boundaries, just this endless plain basically, and eventually things start somehow suggesting themselves, and eventually I gather lots and lots of material. I don't plot in advance. I gather a lot of material, and obviously I need to know where we begin. Otherwise, I won't begin at all. And, I will certainly probably have, ideas of some of the major events of the narrative and probably the order of those events. But that's quite likely to get changed in the writing anyway. And then off we go eventually. Then will come the day when I feel, this is clamoring to be written now. Let's get going. And I duly do the first draft, which will take me, I don't know, several months certainly. And then that gets put aside for a few months. So I can forget about it basically, come back to it, as a reader rather than as the writer. And this is by far the most dispiriting part of the process, where I can see a great deal of what's wrong with it, but not really what to do about it. But the point is, once you see a problem, you're on the way to fixing it, And if you don't see there's a problem there, you're not going to be able to fix it at all. And so as soon as I've gone through that dispiriting stage of the writing, I then start the rewrite. Now, I always write longhand. The original draft is always longhand.
Should we give an advert? Because I now have mini versions because I got you your size of your notebook, but then I accidentally got these as well. So now I'm using them. I'm using the mini version.
Yes,
so it's here's something else I don't know how to pronounce. Sylvine.
I don't know. I was thinking Sylvine, but I don't know. Maybe so. Not
because
sure.
you use the
big one.
The big one.
Yeah, the student's notebook they call it apparently. Yeah. So that's how I do it. But then the rewrite is onto the computer. And it took me a while to reach this stage. And I only wish I'd reached it earlier in my career. I mean, there was a time when it came to the rewrite, I tried to salvage as much as possible of the first draft, and justify as much of it to myself as I possibly could. These days, I actually go at it with utter ruthlessness and, take great delight in chucking stuff away or condensing it, distilling it, refining it, changing the characters' names, changing the order of the paragraphing, reconstructing, restructuring paragraphs, and all of that. Generally speaking, I on average probably end up with like 20% less material, worded, in fact, in the final draft than there was in the first. And then, as I said, that goes off to my agent. I turn uneasily in my bed at night until I hear from him. And eventually that goes to the copy editor of the proof. I don't think you'll mind if I name her. A great lady called Imogen House and Imi, who we become friends, and we've asked to work together on my stuff because we do extremely well. And so, I read through her copy edit, which tends to be very minimal because she said there's not much to copy edit, apart from the obvious things of, the end dashes or changing dashes and things of that nature in terms of the house style. And so I read through that. I've left out a stage, haven't I? No, once I've rewritten onto the computer, print that out. That's right, of course. That goes away with us on holiday to a Greek island, usually, and I can then read through that and make the final twiddles, That then goes off ultimately to Imi, and she does the copy edit. And then, of course, comes the proofs from the publishers, and so I read through the wretched thing yet another time. So I basically read through the final version really at least 3 times. And, luckily at this stage, I don't feel, oh, God, why did I bother? And in fact, on the whole, I'm happy with what I did. But then give it a couple of years and I think, I should have done that. So it never ends.
And one of the things that never ends of that, which is important for all of us, is that sensation, oh God, they might hate it. Have I lost it? Did I ever have it? All the stuff that we do to ourselves. And it's so important to hear you say that because the flag I want to wave all the time is it's not about waiting for the feelings to change before our behaviour supports the writing that we need to do.
Yes.
The thing that got in my way with that wasn't so much depression as anxiety. And when I hear you talk about depression as I think I've heard you say sort of companion or necessary aspect, that it is part of how everything operates.
Yeah.
My thing that stopped me, that I continue to know can stop me if I don't recognise it, is relationship with time generally. The anxiety can say you're meant to have done everything by now, hurry up, yes. And I don't know what to do first. And that for me could be a massive example of overwhelm. Now, obviously everyone's examples will be different, but I'd love to ask you about how you talk to yourself in whatever version of sort of the daily, because I know you are king of write every day.
Yeah, yeah,
and that is how you operate. So
sure.
are there conversations that you have with yourself that help support that? Or I guess maybe one of the things on my mind is the very fact that you're doing it every day. From where I'm sitting, it looks like that means that you've managed to say to yourself, it's not about feeling like it's all going to be okay and brilliant before I do this. This is how I invest in it being its best self.
Well, I think the thing is, I've reached the conclusion that, a story has to take as long as the story takes to write. I don't, very seldom work to deadlines. I mean, it might be for an anthology, but basically I do a novel a year, and everything else, whatever else I can fit in between the various stages of that process, gets done as well. But when I say I write a novel a year, obviously it doesn't take me a year to write that novel. It takes me, I suppose when I think about the amount of time given over to it, probably takes about 7 to 8 months of that year. That is not any kind of a hard and fast rule. Luckily, the publishers are not on my back saying, we need this by next week. And they're very gentle with me, basically. My agent is as well. So I have got that space in which to relax. And, if it takes another few weeks, okay, fine, it takes another few weeks because that's what it needed to do. And so I think I can relax with that. And I don't really need to tell myself, oh, hurry up, or, you don't have to hurry up. I think by now I know that instinctively.
And there's something that feels quite seasonal, maybe, about that your process has its phases. So there's the practice and there's the allowing that.
Yes, I suppose, funnily enough, when I think of what you say, seasonal, I thought that's right. I mean, really, when I think about it, the novel tends to get started, the first draft tends to get started in early autumn, really, probably. So it sees me into the darkest stage of the year. Maybe that's important too, I don't know, it never occurred to me.
I wonder if it is, because I'm interested in how the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves create our reality. And it's a bit like when you talk about being agnostic.
Maybe agnostic might be it. Yeah.
Because I was brought up Jewish, where it's not, do you believe this? It's not, do you believe this literally happened? You're not defined as Jewish because of what you believe. It's cultural, and it's what it's do, and the word is observant and things like that. And so for me, stories weren't about, did they literally happen? They were about, how does this story speak to me about my life and how I sort of show up with other people in the world, about my behaviour. And there's always, I think there has been for me a link between that and the seasons, actually, because we have these sort of festivals at different times of the year. And I certainly find autumn very productive, and that's the Jewish New Year. And it's so interesting hearing how these things, because I hadn't particularly thought about it in those terms, but maybe I was seeing something about myself and hearing you say that, but it is interesting how we find what works for us, because what it sounds like is that with you writing every day, it doesn't need to be the same amount of words. It doesn't need to be the same process. It's pushing the envelope. It's taking steps forward.
The trick I play on myself is I always want to go at least onto the next page of the exercise book, because that could mean I've got 2 sentences at the bottom of this page and one on the next one. That'll do it. It never will, but theoretically it could. I suppose the only time I don't do a great deal of work is when we're away, say, at a convention or a festival, whatever it might be. I still take it away. I still work on it in the in the hotel room. But I don't do as much as I ordinarily would because, there's too much else to do at the event. So I do sort of, let myself up a bit in those terms, in those situations.
I started to ask you about Jenny reading one chapter at a time before you necessarily know what's going to happen for the rest of the book.
Yes. Well, to a certain extent I will know, but, more and more it's a process of exploration, discovery about the characters as well, So, I may have, even this isn't true anymore. I was going to say I will have an ending in sight, but actually I used to have a sort of fallback ending, if you like, if I couldn't come up with anything, or if it couldn't come up with anything better. But in general, the actual process of narrative, often enough it would kind of subsume that idea I have for the ending and then pass on beyond it or develop something else. But these days, over the last few, I really haven't known what the ending was going to be until I probably got to the final chapter. And it seems to work. But it's kind of trusting instinct, given the amount of time I've been doing it.
I have talked to you about your process, my process, things like that. Is there anything that you consider either universal or a good idea for writers generally that you'd want to sort of, like I have my little things that I'd like to throw out there into the world. Is there anything that you would want to gift?
I suppose the main things we've talked about, the few tricks I've learned in 60 odd years of not sitting down to the blank page, bring something to the blank page before you sit down, basically. I think that's crucial, personally. And I think it's as straightforward as saying, realize you can always rewrite. You think, well, this is not very good. Well, yeah, it's not your final version, is it? If we're talking about the first draft, or even the second, depending on how you work. But, it'll get better as you work on it.
Well, in that case, it's been such a pleasure, Ramsey. Thank you so much for joining the Writers' Gym.
My pleasure, Rachel. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Let's do it again.
Let's do it again. You've visited the Writers' Gym with author and coach, Dr. Rachel Knightley. Production and sound design are by Ashley Lexine, and theme music is by Chris Gregory. To join a Writers' Gym workout online or in London, as a guest or as a member, visit writersgym.com or email thewritersgym@rachelknightley.com.